The intention of this is to give you all a little bit more detail around the technicalities of year-over-year percentage deflation in particular, but also it's difficult to do that without relating how that fits into our new forecasting methodology and also into Goldbook IQ. Some of these slides will be familiar to some of you from previous conversations that we've had. Apologies for that, but I think we need them just to make sure we tell the story. This is probably a page which is one of those which is familiar. One of the key differences between how Monitor works today and how Goldbook is going to work in the future is that in Monitor, and all our competitors have done pretty much the same thing, all the forecast values are based on depreciation curves. Now the main reason for that is that's a nice simple way to systemize and database providing forecasts for a number of vehicles at a number of ages and mileages. So the typical line is like the red line on the graph on the left, nice smooth curve with constant mileage per year. As the vehicle ages, it decreases in value. The reality, however, is always somewhat different. I'm not sure there's ever been a vehicle which has actually followed a nice smooth depreciation curve, and it's much more like the blue line on the left, the more jagged line. I come from a leasing background, as you probably know. I was at GE for about 20 years, the majority of that setting residual values in the UK and for other markets. And we always looked at year-over-year percentage deflation rather than depreciation, focusing on what's actually happened to used market prices. And if I go back to when I started, this was in fact what CAP used to talk about. There was a number of indices which were published and talked about, and the main one was the 3-year 36-45 index. But over a period of time, different people got involved, the database changed, some elements of the process changed, and that kind of faded from view. But we're bringing it right back into front and center and really combining these ideas of depreciation and deflation, hopefully to give us some much more reliable forecast values. With deflation, we're always looking at the same age and mileage. So if that was a 3-year 60 year-over-year percentage track, then we'd always be looking at a 3-year 60 value. What is it today? What was it a year ago? And what is the percentage change? And this gives you a much clearer picture of what's actually happening in the used car market. So you can see quite clearly what happened in 2008 with a spiral down in prices, and then what happened in 2009 when prices went rather steeply back up again. And the other benefit you get there is that you can model it statistically, and we'll come to that in a second. In terms of actual calculation of year-over-year percentage deflation, this is an updated version of the example which was in the eShot, which went out with the invite to this session. We start off with what is it worth now. Our example here is a focus at 3660. So we're taking November 2013 black book value. So a 3-year-old vehicle was registered on a 1060 plate. So a 1060 at 60,000 miles, 5925. What we also need to know is what was it worth a year ago. So we take the black book value from November 2012. In 2012, it would have been a 2009 59 plate for a 3-year-old vehicle, and at 60,000 miles, that was 6,200. So how we calculate year-over-year percentage deflation for a single vehicle in isolation like that is looking at our value today, at 1060 plate, today's market, at 60,000 miles, 5925. The value a year ago, November 2012, an 0959 plate at 60,000, 6,200. So the change is a reduction of £275, which is equivalent to minus 4.4%. So we would call that 4.4% deflation. One of the things that is inherent in our year-over-year percentage deflation calculation is that it includes an element of model life. This is because we're always looking at the same vehicle from month to month to month. We are taking account of new models, but we're taking account of new models in the starting black book value. If we included it in here, we get a false picture about what the actual market is doing. But this is the example for one individual vehicle. What we actually want are a number of indices. So we're segmenting the market by age and sector and fuel type. So for each sector fuel type combination, we will have a 1 year 20 deflation index, 2 year 40, 3 year 60, 4 years 80, and 5 years 100, treating all the ages as separate markets. The way we do that is we capture all the available data for every single cap ID. We look at the 3660 values and wherever they're available, and we compare it to what that same vehicle was at 3660 the previous month, and that will give us a month-on-month movement. Therefore, normally if we're going from August to September or December to January or February to March, we'll get an increase in that month-on-month percentage because we're changing the plate, which represents a 3-year 60 value. But we're always looking at a 12-month period. We're looking at a year-over-year percentage. So always, if we're in September, we're comparing to last September. The way we create the index is to weight those month-on-month percentage movements according to the total registrations from the registration plate period. So we're looking at values for each individual ID. Therefore, we get a month-on-month percentage movement for each individual ID. We weight that into one movement, in this example, for lower medium diesel vehicles, based on the registrations for each ID at the time of registration. We have to have a start point, and our start point is, I think from memory, January 2003. So we take a start point of 10,000. We could have used individual weighted 3-year values, but actually from a technical point of view, it makes much more sense to use the same value for everything. Therefore, we've indexed it all off a value of 10,000. Doesn't really matter what the number is at all. It's just a tool to give us the actual year-over-year percentage. So we apply those consecutive month-on-month movements, and after 12 months, we'll have our first year-over-year point. So we'll do that calculation we looked at on the previous page. In 12 months' time, what is our resulting value compared to what it was 12 months ago? And that then forms, we do that for every single individual month, that then forms this long-term track similar to the graph that you see at the bottom, and again a similar shape to what we saw in that upper medium graph before. Some of the other metrics which are often used to describe what's happening in the used car market. We know that you guys in particular come under pressure from various headquarters and various parts of your organizations to express things as a percentage of the list price. In terms of used values and forecast values, that's an entirely artificial metric. If you go and look at cars going through the block tomorrow or wherever it happens to be, nobody says, well, what was that when it was new? The only general rule that you have, and it's not always the case, there are exceptions, the only general rule is that a used car will always have to cost less than a new car. In terms of trying to apply that to used values, if you think of the situation where there was a price increase on 1st of July 2010, you got two identical cars sat next to each other, one registered in June at one list price, one registered in July at another list price. If they're at the same mileage, everybody would identify those as being exactly the same vehicle. Wouldn't make any reference back to what was the original list price. And again, the list price doesn't really bear any resemblance to what anybody's actually paid for the car anyway. It is, however, sometimes a useful analysis tool. We can sometimes use it to transform data where it's difficult to do comparisons to make a common metric we can do comparisons with, but we wouldn't really use it in general for anything directly feeding into used values or forecast values. You do often see reports, particularly from the auction companies. They particularly like to do this. Disposals or sales value tracking. You'll often get the articles in Fleet News or whatever, your markets prices have gone up 3%. It very rarely has much relevance to what's happened in the used market because there is so much variation that is inherent in that data. You've got model mix, age, mileage, condition, the issues of model changes when you've got new models coming in artificially make the market look better. In fact, it's just a different basket of vehicles, and it is very difficult to pick up on subtle market changes. If there's a big market change, if there's a big dip, or if there's a feeding frenzy, then you will see it coming through in that data, but it's very difficult to pick out anything that's more subtle. And still occasionally we see some kind of unweighted indices, taking a value for each ID and adding them all up and divided by the total. And again, that's never going to give you a true picture of the market. You always need to put some kind of weighting in there, whether that's your own fleet weighting, whether that's total registrations. You need to do that to get some real feel for what the actual market is. So what do we do with all this year-over-year percentage data? Well, we said we segment it by age and sector and fuel type. We generate those graphs that we looked at, for example, for upper medium 3-year 60. And then we have a lot of input variables, which broadly feed into 9 buckets. And again, a lot of you be familiar with this. It's things like macroeconomic things like GDP and unemployment. It's the supply side, total registrations, or registrations from the individual vehicle sector, fleet registrations, which would normally lag back 3.5, 4 years, and then things like exchange rates and fuel prices. And what we do is we take those input variables and we have a regression engine which runs combinations of all those different factors to tell us what is the best statistical, historical relationship between the change in the used car price and those individual input factors. So effectively what it gives us is a series of equations. And what we want to do is pick the best, most representative equation, because if we know those relationships and we have forecasts for the significant input variables, then that gives us our forecast for how the used market is going to move. But it's important we don't just blindly take the results that come out of that. We're combining that with our editorial expertise. My team will sit down and we'll look at that and does it make sense? Does it make sense in terms of our expectations of what we're seeing in the marketplace? Does it make sense in terms of the historical context? Is it worth putting in as our forecast? And even to the extent of, does the 1-year deflation assumption look like it makes sense against the 2-year and the 3-year assumption? So there's a lot of analysis that has to go in there. There's also the various kind of pitfalls of regression. So we're very aware that one of the assumptions that's behind taking that equation is that the future will be the same as the past. Now we're taking data going back to beginning of 2003. We've got quite a long period in there. And it is possible that there might be some time where we decide that the future isn't expected to be the same as the past. And if that was the case, then we would not take that statistical relationship. We would override that and put our own manual estimation in. And through IQ, if we were doing that, then that will be fully explained in the commentary. So just a quick example of one of the proof of concept exercises that we did. I think this was back in April. This is for upper medium diesel at 3-year 60. The blue line is the actual track of the year-over-year percentage. Excuse me. The red line is our statistical model. So you can see for most of that period, the two lines are very close. So the model actually very accurately describes the change in the used car price in terms of just 4 or 5 input variables. There is, however, a 9-month period where prices actually went up a lot faster than we would have expected them to with the knowledge of those levels of the input variables. And interestingly, it's not when prices went down, it's actually when they went back up. And in conversation with the Black Book guys, the feeling is that for a long time, or for some period of time, things had been getting better, but people were a bit reluctant to believe it. Once they did believe it, they were battling hand over fist to try and get available stock that they could turn quickly. So you see this kind of difference between the model and the actual year-over-year percentage for something like upper medium. If, however, you were to look at something like large executive, you don't see this phenomenon at all. They weren't pumping extra thousands and thousands into the higher priced vehicles. It was into the sorts of vehicles they thought they could turn over quickly and still make a decent profit on. But if you take that period out, that 9-month period, we've actually explained more than 85% of the variation in the used car price with those few variables. And what we do with that, we need to put that in the context of producing a forecast. So we'll concentrate on these 5 points at 20,000 miles per year, 1 year 20, 2 year 40, up to 5 years 100. And for each of those points, we always start off with a current Black Book value. Now for that example of that insignia, those values are already in Black Book. We'll take those direct from Black Book. If we had an example where that vehicle wasn't 5 years old, then we use a system of what we call donor vehicles, which would normally be a previous generation, or if there isn't a previous generation, then we need to make some kind of judgment as to what do we think the best comparison would be. But if it's in Black Book, we'll take directly that Black Book value. So if you think of the 1 year position, that 1 year 20 point, we look at what is a 1 year 20 value today. I think that says 10,200. I can't actually see that on my screen. And then what's our forecast for a 1 year diesel upper medium vehicle? And if it was that the market was going to go down by 10%, and this is for the ease of calculation, that doesn't mean everything's going to go down 10% in the first year, then our base forecast, a 1 year 20, will be a reduction of 1,025 from that starting value, which I can't work out in my head, 9175 is that? But that's not the end of the story. We then have further adjustments which we make to that. It's said that there is an element of model life included in that year-over-year percentage deflation, but that's an average for that sector and fuel type that we've done the deflation forecast for. We recognise that some vehicles in general, if they are newer, will do slightly better. Some vehicles which are older or due for replacement will do slightly worse. So we have some analysis by sector and fuel type which assigns a model aging factor. And then we have additional model life factors in terms of the fuel efficiency and a deliberately broad umbrella of future trends. A section where we can graduate any differences and take account of wherever we think an individual vehicle is going to behave differently from the sector, age and fuel type for which we've done that deflation forecast. And then finally, we still need to have editorial opinion. Editorial adjustment, my team sit down and look at all the numbers and say, do they make sense? Petrol against diesel, that insignia against Mondeo, etc., etc., etc. And then we have the mileage curves, which will fill vertically in that grid. And then seasonality will do two things. That will give us the intermediate month forecasts, so 13 to 23, 25 to 35, etc. And also to move the forecast from today in November into December into January. That gives us our full grid for all our master vehicles. And then we have the walk up, the subsidiary relationships, which will populate for the entire vehicle range. Now at the same time, we've been working not just on the internal methodology, we've also been working on the new enhanced customer product, Goldbook iQ, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where we give the full transparency of all those assumptions, sharing that market intelligence, and we've got commentary wherever we're making a change to an existing forecast or there's a new model or a new derivative, then there'll be commentary to explain what we've done and why we've done it, how we've positioned those vehicles. So the benefits of the internal methodology is that we're combining a bit more statistical rigor with the expert opinion and the market intelligence. We're rooting it in genuine black book values wherever we can. One of the disadvantages of the current monitor system is that it takes the latest plate. So today that would be 1363 plate and applies depreciation curves forward. Now unfortunately that's actually the least reliable information which we have in the black book data set. By the time a vehicle is 12 months old, it's found its place in the marketplace, it's based on genuine sales, we're much more confident in that value. It enables both the short-term, the used car forecast and also a short-term forecast. We currently do 12 months onwards in new and used monitor. We do Black Book Plus, which is 0 up to 3 months into the future. But now we actually have the ability to introduce next year a new product which will fill in that gap and do 0 to 12 months. Internally, we get a lot of productivity gains. And one of the things that means for customers is that new vehicles, new editions, new models will from January go direct into product instead of having to wait for the monthly upload. And hopefully this enhances our position as being the independent benchmark. Everybody's got clarity on the methodology and the rationale behind those numbers. And one thing that we can't do today is break down the differences between today's black book value and our historical forecasts. I can tell you in total how accurate a forecast was, but in the future we'll be able to say, right, well it's different by say 6%, 4% of that was the market, 3% the other way was new model premium, whatever it happens to be, to a very granular level, and hopefully that all feeds back into our forecasting process. And it's a hub for future product development. The immediate one being Goldbook IQ, but then also next year we'll be working on a new forecasting product where you don't just see what the assumptions are behind the numbers, you're actually able to alter those assumptions and see what that does to the numbers, and that'll be for use in terms of residual value setting and also for revaluation purposes. In terms of Goldbook IQ, I mean, obviously there's a lot more that you can see, but just in the context of what we've just been talking about, you'll be able to see where we've built up those black book values. We said they may come direct from black book if that vehicle's 5 years old. If it's not 5 years old, we'll have this system of donors. So you can see in this example, we have our target actual current vehicle at 1 year 20, a donor at 1 year 20. There's a difference between them, £800. And if our 2-year value on the donor vehicle is £11,000, we uplift that by the proportional difference between the two. So in that case up to 11,650. And that then gives us what would this vehicle be if it was 2 years old today. And we do that until we've got the full 5-year history. You see the deflation profile. So that is for each of those age of vehicles, how they expected to move year by year by year. You'll notice that if you add up, for example, those three 3660 numbers, they don't quite come to the answer at the bottom. And that's because it's not an additive process, it's a multiplicative process. We're taking our current 3-year 60 value, reducing that by 5.6%, then reducing that result by 4.9, and that result by 5.7. So you get a slight difference. But that number at the bottom is the impact, the movement from today's black book value to that initial forecast. You also see what are the significant factors that have gone into the regression analysis, and you'll see what the forecasts are by year for those individual input variables. In this case, the black numbers are externally sourced, and the blue underlined numbers are where we've done something. So it may be the example that there's only a 3-year forecast available and we need a 5-year forecast, or it may be we're doing a separate level of analysis and we're looking at how good are these independent bodies at forecasting these metrics. And depending on their historical performance, we may make an adjustment to those numbers that they've published. But where we do that, there'll be very clear commentary about what we've done and why we've done it. In terms of the used vehicle forecast, it works in a very similar way. And it's based on what is the age of that vehicle going to be at the end of the forecast period. So if it was a 3-year-old vehicle today and it was going out for 2 years, then that's going to be a 5-year-old vehicle at the end of the forecast period. So we take a 5-year-old value today and move that forward for the 2-year forecast period, according to how we think a 5-year-old value is going to move over those next 2 years. So that's applying the deflation. If it's an existing profile generation, then that will get the model life and editorial adjustment from the new car forecast. If it's a discontinued range, then that will only get a model life overlay on the basis of the age of the model, that analysis by sector and fuel type. And that calculates by default in the system the values for each year-old plate. So today it would calculate 1262, 1161, example, up to 0858. And then there's a calculation that generates values for the intermediate plates. Those are at standard mileage. We then have our mileage curves that get applied. One of the benefits that you see now in IQ is instead of 3 mileage bands, there'll be 5. So a central one, too high and too low, and those are differentiated by sector and fuel type. Example of how that use calculation works. I think this is almost exactly what I just explained. A 3-year-old value going out for 2 years. It's going to be 5 years old. We take a 5-year-old today, deflate it forward 2 years, and apply model life and editorial overlays where necessary, and adjust for mileage. I'm sure you're aware of what we've been doing this year in terms of our sector reforecasts, and the intention of this is that it's kind of like a halfway house between the old monitor system and our new Goldbook methodology. There's several reasons for doing it. One is to get our forecasting team thinking about things always in terms of the new methodology. Another one is to try and minimize that impact of switching over, but also to review some vehicles which we haven't reforecast for a while and look at those relationships between key models within the sectors. Now, to do that, we've had to remove the old monitor macroeconomic weightings, which, you know, they were put in almost as a knee-jerk reaction in 2008. They were quite crude, and it was one of those areas where it was recognized we could do a lot better. And that's where the new internal forecasting methodology really has come from. The effect of that, in general, has been that there have been increases for larger vehicles, and that smaller vehicles have been flat or seen some small decreases. And the intention of all this is that it's getting us into talking about things in a common language in terms of market movements, year-over-year percentage deflation, and enabling us to have much more detailed and effective conversations, particularly with the manufacturers. Someone described it to me last week as inviting our customers to disagree with us. But I think it's even a step further. It's actually inviting our customers to help us to improve our forecasts, because we recognize we can't get everything right all the time, and we'll take as much information as we can from as many different sources and try and feed that in to improve the forecasts. In terms of timing, the internal system is operational. I mentioned, I think at the beginning of the call, we've just about finished upper medium. That is in quality control now. And as vehicle sectors are passed through quality control, then those expected movements will be communicated to everybody as soon as we can. So as soon as the sector's finished, we're going to push that out to all customers. The full deadline is end of November for December product. We move from monitor forecasts to Goldbook forecasts. There won't be any change to the technical content of existing CAP products. So what you get today, you'll see exactly the same thing next month. The difference will be it'll be a new methodology, the Goldbook methodology behind the numbers, and not the old monitor methodology. There's IQ user acceptance testing during this month, starting very soon. and then Goldbook IQ to be released in the first week of December, and new vehicles going directly into product from January. That's pretty much everything that I had prepared. I can't see any questions that have come through on the chat list, but has anybody got any questions?
Nothing from me, Dylan. It all made sense. Thank you very much.
Good stuff. Paul Graham, anything?
Well, one thing, are you going to send the presentation through? Because it'd be useful to have a copy of it.
I will, of course, yes.
Yeah. And just for my benefit, I might have missed the point, but when a brand new vehicle comes through,
yeah,
how will you get the future value set?
Okay, it's pretty much the same as what happens today. If you're talking about a new version of an existing model, then we would look at what has happened in the past in terms of model changes and what did we see in terms of increased in used values for the new model, and then put that in context of today's change. Is today's change a bigger change than we saw for those historical new models, or is it much more like a facelift? But in the case where it is a brand new vehicle, then we're pretty much in the same boat as everybody else of having to make some assumptions. So we will always be comparing it to something. The difference being going forward, you'll be able to see what we've compared it to, how we've positioned it, and what we think its key competitors are. Whereas today, really all you see is the number, and if you're having a conversation with Jeff or myself, then you probably get some of the other information as well. But you know, it is all going to be documented and upfront. But everybody
in the IQ product.
That's in IQ, yeah.
Yeah.
But everybody's in exactly the same boat. If there is a brand new vehicle, you have to compare it against something. Where the difference will be, we'll be telling you what we've compared it to and how we've come up with a number.
Yeah. And my other question is, where you have a vehicle which has been in existence for quite a while, where you've got your deflation going through, as you mentioned that people don't buy vehicles as a percentage of list, there must get to a point where it will bottom out, but it won't go down year on year because of its life cycle. There must become a point where the curve flattens or becomes horizontal.
Well, we do actually flatten it in terms of the percentage change for aging models. But they do continue to decrease. But of course, as they decrease in value, those percentage changes also get very small. So by the time you've got something down to, you know, £3,000, 1% is only going to be a £25 change, which you hardly notice. So in effect, yes, they do really flatten out. But we would still be building in a percentage adjustment, even if, you know, it's already at a very low value and the pound note impact is very small.
Because the competition or the newest vehicle within that portfolio of vehicles, there will always be a link with the customer's mind as a vehicle will have, you know, its highest residual value versus the one at the bottom, and there will be a point where they say, well, do I want the latest product or do I go for something potentially a bit cheap? So I was just trying to understand that I've been, you know, in dialogue with Jeff about this particular question, just trying to understand that. So, okay.
Yeah, I think it's a general point about used values. You know, you'll often see, depending on how the vehicle's been released and how the first ones have come back into market, then you often see a quite high position when it first comes back into the market, which then reduces fairly steeply, but then it settles into what is more like a normal market position. And that's one of the benefits of waiting until it's 12 months old before we actually apply that black book value. Anything that's less than 12 months old, we will be setting an adjustment that we think it is worth over and above the previous model at 3660, and it adjusts proportionally across the other ages and mileages.
Okay, and then thanks. And then my final question is, will there be transparency of your master vehicles for each manufacturer?
Absolutely, yeah. You can see the master vehicle in each vehicle range.
So that will be in IQ as well?
It's all in IQ, yeah. The only thing really that you don't see in IQ, and for obvious reasons, is the statistical details of that regression analysis. All you really see is the results.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Dylan, perhaps not exactly related to this, but do you foresee any change to your processes or timings for introducing new models into Monitor, either in terms of the data that you would look to get from a manufacturer, or some lead times that you might require, or anything like that?
It's kind of the same as today. You would still need to be getting the information to us in time for us to actually do the forecast. But the intention is that as soon as that vehicle is released from embargo, then we would have a forecast completed, and it gets pushed out in MVP&O at the same time as the new vehicle data does to customers. But clearly, you would have to make sure we have the information in time for us to do the forecast.
And what you said, Dylan, is that from January? We won't have to wait for it.
Sorry, yes, that is due to happen from January. We didn't want to try and do everything all at the same time, so we'll wait for some of the dust to settle from the transition from Monitor to Goldbook. We'll introduce IQ, and then in January we'll have the new vehicles going direct into product. Sorry, David, did you have another question?
No, I think actually you pretty much covered it. In essence, in terms of your timings, everything's pretty much carry over, as far as I can see.
Okay, anybody else have anything else?
No, I think that's a very useful overview. Certainly listening to yourself for the last sort of 45 minutes is certainly useful just to hear what's coming, really, because I don't think we've seen an awful lot. But certainly that explanation, yes, it's been very useful, so thanks very much.
Good. Well, thank you all for joining. I will send a copy of the presentation through, which we've just talked about. And of course, if you have any more questions, then you know where I am.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Dylan.
Okay.
Thanks, Dylan. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye now.
Thanks very much, Dylan. Thank you.
Bye.